In the Darkness I See, by Anon Y. Chapter 3. A Strange New Client. He wore wet hair, the unkempt insignia of a teenager. He was 20. He was a rather attractive and slender young man with a deeply mournful brow. A small bruise crept up his face, subtle but unmistakable. Though his outrightly prepossessing charm was palpable, a furrow controlled his face. He looked downward most of the time. Somehow he did this in a superior way. There was no need for the darkest of indiscretion to uproar for that young man to have dismantled and dismissed affection. The loss that he bore and thin armor bared, in his heart, so distasteful, controlled his life. That was the only obvious thing about him. People were good for only one thing, hurting him. I had aided a multitude of clients before him that had been similar in angst, but it had always been insta-clearly no more than insecurities and shallow nihilism that had fueled their ardor for ignominy. He was different. His melancholy was unmatched. His face, though, was so familiar, like I had always known him. While my memory of our first meeting's inception remains foggy, I remember that a few weeks before our first interaction, there had been some pro bono work brought to me by my colleague, Randall Hall's wife. The newly made Hall, Victoria, was a desperate mother. She was by no means a trained professional, but she was like most older women, wise. She knew the fragility of a man's soul like no one else. She also understood, to her core, that once a man loses himself, there is no way back. Like my mother, she was privy to that reality through first-hand account. First husband-hand account, to be specific. Like my father, that first husband had killed himself. Unlike my father, he hadn't taken the prolonged approach. Randall had described it, that thing of hers, to me much before Victoria and I had met, saying, he took his 12-gauge shotgun to the bathroom and gave Victoria that redecoration she had been wanting. Victoria had found her husband before her boy had come home, and so that, I reasoned, wasn't the origin of his deep and desolate despondency. Something else was eating her boy, that much she knew. His name was Thomas. He insisted that I used his full name, dictating it to be more appropriate. After an indiscriminate amount of time calling him by his lofty title, we entered real therapy and began using his shortened name. Immediately after I called him Tommy, he prodded back at me. He said impatiently, "I asked you not to call me that. What exactly are you getting at?" I responded after a pensive moment, saying, "I want to show you that we are not only associates. I am going to be guiding and healing from the inside out, client and aid. We must burst through all the frivolous barriers of your growth." After a brief and respectful pause, I reinstated my claim. "Open up," I said calmly. "Let me in." After another awkward silence, he stormed out. There were 12.5 minutes to spare. It had begun. Each time I had enlisted that direct and confrontational approach, my clients had all brought forth some version of furious rejection. That was how I knew that Thomas was coming back. Though few had expressed such a visceral rejection of reality, at some point they all had collected their personal grievances and compared them to their torturous existence's persistence, finding their way back to their senses and then to me. I knew immediately that his IQ rested well above average, 120 or higher, I supposed. It seemed feasible, given his concise and fast answers, allied with his use of quasi-insightful probing when faced with insecurity. In time, I would understand his IQ, especially his fluid reservoir, to be much higher. After my technical probes, placed in our brief introductions, had been analyzed, it became abundantly clear to me that a majority of his every second was a war, a battle bonanza, of continued lifelong, thoughtful avoidance of trauma-induced strife and insecurity. It was not but seemingly a crafty path skillfully navigated by his internalized intellectual. Survival it was, as it is with most base, child-grown underground caverns callable as adverse incompleteness. Personality disorders or ocean classifications being simple temperament-mediated manifestations of that said same unworthiness foe proven by something. There was definitely something to Tommy. He practically breathed silent screaming. I knew too, much mostly for that reason, that the problem was of a strong sensual nature. I postulated 3 possible predictions. My first query: Tommy had experienced constant disapproval or disregard from his father, or from the plentiful stream of repeat new paternal influences so prestigiously paraded through his home by Victoria. And so, through the anguish and the pounding care comparisons aplenty popping, a low satiating Oedipal fruit had grown high egregiously, ripened to voluptuosity. Too much now it had become for him to compartmentalize it all. My ankles swelled with empathetic stagnation for him. My second thought was that the widow's masculine parade had a devious and traitorous partaker who had taken Tommy's innocence, that dissatisfying secret no longer hideable. My third and final ideation was that the young man was too intelligent for his own good and had comorbid sociopathy and narcissistic personality disorder, perhaps disguised purposefully or guiltily by expression to me of some surely researched symptoms of avoidant personality disorder. I had a sneaky suspicion, by way obviousness and experience, that Tommy's truth was a partial mixture of all 3 of my postulates. After all, no rainy day ever coats the back of a spoon. It swamps and monsoons. I was entrapped within my curiosity and engulfed by my aidful magnanimity. Tommy, the masterful manipulator I would come to know, missed the next scheduled meeting, and the next. His absence troubled me. I tried calling Victoria 10 minutes before the 3rd session to ask where he had been. She didn't answer. 10 minutes later, he walked in. He handed over a note. He had inscribed the border with a sumptuous decoration as though it was a page from the Gutenberg Bible, rife with ornamentation. He walked out. I did not chase him. He had written, and I read, the following. Women are vessels for adoration as men are the stubborn chariots, with the muddy layers of hard decisions and huge mistakes flaking off in chunks onto the paving below. Men are never truly loved, not by any other than their mothers. Oh, those Oedipal counterparts. A mother, in all her glory, cannot separate herself from her new collection of organs. Their small creature, so lovingly created, needs not to be kind, careful, or keen. The mother, no matter the circumstance, will offer up her life for that child with no indignation. And so we have arrived at love, this truest and most unbridled locution, love. Most men will not feel this again for any lengthy sentencing, at least. One lucky man in 100,000 may find themselves at the peak of their conquest for all and have the short-term potent sense of being lusted for and groveled over. If such a man is ignorant enough to misinterpret these displays for anything other than self-serving prayers, then the man is stripped from his supreme locum and banished to fall to the realm of destitution. The admired matron allowed by his pre-downfallen heart, with his pride in her talons, squeezes the essence out from the mere mortal until he is squashed into humble solitude. This stain is worn by the man for as long as he draws breath, the pitiful anger residing within his belly for the remainder of his damned life. This is the fate for the lucky, favored, and few men. It sounded like the machinations of a broken young man. That eloquent prose, with all its doleful depravity, reminded me of my father. The anguish was so intense and misguided. I was magnetized to the prospect of deciphering the impetus in him to craft such a scornful judgment. Even with my mind begging me to walk away undamaged, my thirst for resolution engrossed me past reason. Striding towards the unknown, I began. I couldn't help myself, and so I officially and internally decided to accept him as my new client. I had been practicing psychology for 20 years before I met Tommy. Never had trouble been bestowed upon me with such abundance than within my first couple of interactions with him. I knew that, with strife so contagious, the path forward would be laden with instability. Furthermore, I was sure that, when the solutions were uncovered, the following piece was to be most precarious. I understood that Tommy had traveled too far into thought to be made whole with more knowledge. With him especially, continued dialogue was to be a necessary part of his healing, even well after my administration of aid was to be so-called completed. I had to begin tenderly. I hoped that the fundamental structure of my therapy with Tommy was going to be like my usual style of psychological succor. I planned to unearth the truth through discomfort, listen to the explanation, and then offer analyses and aid from there. Like any other science that I had known and loved, the need for testing and probing was the basis for the generation of my results. The solutions that repaired all my clients' damage needed fuel. The fuel I used was the acceptance of what caused imprecise and inappropriate feelings. Troubled upbringings, chemical imbalances, unfavorable personages, problematic youths, distressing events, or even stagnated adolescences always came at a lofty price. Tommy was no different to the others I had helped before him. Perhaps smarter, but no different. Reinforced by Freud's discoveries within the inner workings of the unconscious and Chomsky's understandings of linguistics as the drivers for limitation and perceptual mapping in the formation of psychological perceptions in young minds, I knew that my place was to peer through the anger and the pain into truth. Diving into the drivers of behavior was the only approach to enable correction of the errors in his behavior. Like most of my peers, I took a dynamic approach to therapy. What seemed to be most efficacious was the use of psychoanalysis and behaviorism in a cooperative manner. Each methodology yielded interesting outcomes and possible rehabilitations, but together those two approaches worked remarkably well. I could never side with Freud or Skinner because I used them both. In its totality, the therapy that I administered was necessitated by my desire to develop and mend the client's mind. And so, I focused not on the minutiae of the many theories, inaccuracies, tribulations, or create discoverers. I felt that intricacies such as those wasted time. Additionally, I was especially cautious of my complex relationship with the spirit of Freud. With Tommy especially, I needed all the time I could gather. After Tommy's second hiatus had come to a close, and he finally felt it appropriate to at least hang around for more minutes than comfortable, we were instantly elevated. As soon as he acquainted himself with the leather of my listening seat, I fell under an unwelcome feeling. Simultaneous was my simple, his presence enrapturement. I hoped that it was some primal exuberance originating within my love of conflict. Greetings were short. "Welcome back," I murmured, still vibrating from the potentialities flying through my mind. "Thanks," he quickly replied. "Have you read my Rhapsody?" I took a moment before answering, because while I had read his work, I was still unsure of how to discuss it within the context of healing him. And so, with little reactionary emotion, I robotically stated, "Yes, it was interesting, rather nihilistic, slightly sociopathic in fact." His reaction was hard and fast, shouting, "That's it?" He was irate, fuming like some toxic cauldron, writhing beneath and above the steamy surface of something more than both of us. Unlike his last upset, he remained seated across from me. A waspish delight then filled his face. He began to rile me up. I was impressed with him. Logically, so boring a person he was from my perspective, the experience of life burnt and watched and felt and flowered into my sadness at the unoriginality of his little view-awaiting opening. In my right eye, though, he could see the truth that I fully understood, with all of me, his lament. I had been bestowed with a collection of certificates and in-depth understandings of any and all things linguistic, cultural, psychological, and educational. However, with all those attributes sedimented firmly within my arsenal, I still had found nothing of real substance. Approximate feelings of true love had flown by me all my life, sticking once or twice like bird shit to statue. As referenced in his odious opus to the elusive nature of love, I had managed to creep to the top of my field, the wondrous exploration of the mind, and found myself with a large assortment of things, people, and wealth. Satisfaction, though, had and still did felt and feel like a mysterious shadow, cast by, but never beholden to, the very things I was chasing. Never captured, never truly submerged, I couldn't bathe in the depth of true circumambient love. Those thoughts intensely spiraled in the back of my mind as we continued on. That was until he unfolded an index card with writing on the front and back. "Did you write this?" he implored. "Did I write what?" He interrupted my curious response by reading from the card, saying, "Love is a secondary attachment, like a barnacle under a voyager's wooden ship. The barnacle's parasitic adhesion persists on the wealth and grandiosity of the vessel it calls its home. The vessel, if never truly finished, makes for a troublesome life for the barnacle. An accomplished and comfortable ship, with its wood softened by time, may make for a long-term home, even with the arduous journeys through the unclear, unknown, and nutrient-rich seas of life. Most ships, though, are scraped of their nuisances to streamline their path. The barnacle, so optimistic and faithful, with lofty aspirations firmly grasping its heart, will die, its lost succor releasing its grip to the murky waters below, perhaps to be devoured by some grotesque creature. Its amoral termination brings no joy or revelation." How did he find my dissertation? I asked myself, still reeling from his attempting to terminate my authority. "Yes," I replied, "I wrote that." Tommy adjusted himself in his seat. No longer slumped, he emboldened his posture, his shallow victory robustly vouchsafed to him by the powers of the impending reality. He had come to me with his own assortment of argumentative ammo. "You see," postulated Tommy, "I return to you not as a client, but as a brother of intellect. I read up on your depiction of humanity in all its complex glory. You lectured me on the possible prosperity within life, but your own written claims all seemingly lead to the same drab and dissatisfying conclusion. It seems to be meaningless drivel with little to no hope for the future or even the present. Your dissertation, I mean. While you hide behind sophisticated metaphors in fear of reality, I hold these dark truths to the light, revealing their insidious underbellies, so impregnated with rot and bubbling with poisonous wrath." We sat for a moment in silence, Tommy and I, my unmoved affect clearly irritating him. "Maybe it comes from your father," he continued, "that Soviet survivor. The pseudo-intellectual destruction of the mid-20th century Russia must have weighed heavily on him. Maybe he had been so crushed that he shared the same fate as my late father. Your mother, perhaps. She needs no introduction. Quiet and mournful, surely. She probably had little time for you, didn't she?" "That's enough," I firmly stated. "Do you honestly think that you can invert the professional relationship here? Why would you want to, anyway?" I thought instantly, as always with me, of all the implications back and forward dated of the assuredly true truth that Victoria must have innocently divulged my background to Tommy in the hopes of making a constructive relationship between him and I. I bet that she thought it would have helped by binding us to the shared loss of our father figure at a developmental age. She obviously didn't realize into what Tommy would ultimately morph it. I couldn't help but become irritated. As I sat in the silence that my slight hostility had gifted me, I thought of my parents, precisely the diversion for which Tommy had hoped. Therein lay the problem with Tommy's wit. He was searching for the core. He drilled, not only into his own mind, but into the minds of all. Surface-level pleasantries or even rich joys were only there to be fully examined. Stumbling downwardly across perplexing insecurities, malicious intents, and inhumane ideations along the way. The young man truly thought that his angst, focused into a narrow stream and directed at me, would somehow dislodge my own system of working knowledge, faith, and understanding. It did just that. So, I told him that the meeting was over. "I was just starting to have some fun, though," he said. "Let's start on where you find yourself now. Why so alone? Why so unhappy?" He was prodding obviously hard, craving something to put an end to his insolence. "This is not a therapy session for me," I protested like some amateur thespian. "I am here to help you solve the problems that are eating away at you, not to be lectured on your postulations of who or what I am. I am not here to receive your misguided onslaught, fed only by hearsay or second-hand knowledge. This meeting is over, not because I cannot handle your shallow prowess, but rather because allowing this mutiny of a therapeutic session would only serve to embolden your dangerous pathologies. Now we both have something to think about before our next session. Goodbye." He stared at my door-pointing finger as it faintly quivered. "I saw something," laughed Tommy, "just like this in some movie. Hell, some movies. I just didn't think it would be this easy. Like characters being penned into the poignancy of irrelevance, we are. In the click of my finger, in half, we are now inside something called a blood sun. Not in the center, but inside the thing. The red drops of the outer blood sun pulling like lava lamp lumps of ruby ice cream somewhere. Inside and out we are now. We are there, squared. Not us now. Oh no, not us. But something consciousness has us there. I can feel it. We can all see it." With those sentencings no longer a possibility, but a reality, I was struck both dumbfounded and embarrassed. We stared satisfyingly at one another, all other emotions peripheral. Tommy left soon after, and, as he walked out, I looked at our timekeeper. "There goes another session with time left on the clock," I mumbled. Tommy was right. My vessel had never been and remained not strong enough for that beguiling barnacle to ever become a cling-along. The love I had desired had been impossible to maintain within my troubled life, unsettled and unfortified in my drives, wants, and needs. All the structures of my ship were sturdy and well supported, with explanations and rationalizations in every room. No tile left unturned, no wall left unpainted, no screw missing, no fixture out of place. The substructure, though, the rotten sludge lying beneath, cancerous in nature, never had allowed, and remained not in allowing, for true attachment. After the anti-loveliness of what had just been finished echoing enough throughout my light labor chambers, all sorts of clinically proper and retaliatorily improper theories, acronyms, and other miscellaneous judgments abounding, I returned home. Upon my seclusion's once again successful instantiation, I searched through my old documents. I soon after found the dissertation from which Tommy had read. I reveled in the dissimilarity between Tommy's sentiment and the dissertation I had written. I had called it Anthropological Truths of the Human Experience. A certain dehumanizing thoughtfulness was seemingly abundant within the passages of which Tommy had spoken. However, the dissertation, in full, had explored human relations with a level of earnest honesty and great complexity that was unjudgeable as anything but... I wanted desperately to absolve myself of Tommy's incomplete judgment, but found myself at his mercy. I couldn't understand why. I couldn't understand why. I couldn't understand why. I couldn't understand why I wrote the following unsendable email to an empty recipient box. The story of my dissertation is simple, I reread in my head or over it. In conjunction with a colleague, after reading through many anthropologically grounded psychological records, we came across various seemingly to eye untrained disparate theories interpreting the truth of relationships. Basically, in accumulating theories and adding our nuance, we wrote rather most completely of man's diabolically daft mating strategy. In analyzing the vibrant reality, we furthermore discussed how people's psychology had fallen behind modernity. In our short theorization, crystallizing the entirety of Western communal mating, we delineated many truths. One truth was stunningly clear. It seemed impossibly imperative for women to be cognizant of men's intentions. It was rather unnerving. Exulting in my remaining neutrality, I read the following feel-exonerating section of the email, quoting my old work, out loud to no one. The realities of man's mind are simple. There are two main integrated provisions for success in mating that have been solidified throughout human history. The first imperative is to mate and leave immediately. With this technique finalized, gambling with low stakes, a man, so-called, spreads his seed and hopes for the best. Abandoning the probabilistic offspring is the low-cost scenario. The alternate approach is what truly defines a man's life. The secondary attempt at evolutionary success, usually soul-derived from a man of little facile fitness, enacts focused attention on familial responsibility and child-rearing. This more responsible and socially beneficial route allows for an almost certain positive yield. Additionally, the woman is not abandoned, thus allowing for a healthier woman, child, and extrapolating outwards a more robust society. Due to this reality, there is a strong call for enforced monogamy within most successful religions and cultures. See Figure 2.1b for positive feedback loop of religio-cultural enforced monogamy. The faith that is required for this latter mating strategy to flower is dependent on the value of the woman into which a man is investing. Men, highly visual beings, are easily caught in a rather imprisoning decision matrix. Women, who present as a contributor to the Type 1 mating strategy, will draw in the men of Type 1 mating strategy thinking. Most men of this thinking will either leave or abort their low-level probability machine when given the chance. With the implementation of highly effective contraceptives, we are faced with a large question. With the muted physiological realities of womanhood ever present, one may ask, why emphasize monogamous relationships or attain any responsibility with regards to a long-term partner? Now overwhelming, these contraceptive technologies scream for hedonic lives, granting Type 1 mating benefit to women as well as men. The reality of this type of existence is simple. It is causing the rapid denigration of one of the most important moral virtues, commitment. Though our scientific prowess has allowed women to manipulate their biological realities, the psychological impacts of low-stakes relationships still bear down upon most men and women, never truly belonging to one another. Inconsequential mating does not exist. When discussing the efficacious value systems that allowed for responsibility as a virtue, not an unplanned externality, fathers have always been of keystone importance. Ever since we could think enough to write, we have told the same story and reiterated the same lives. Special precautions have been taken in most societies, always among the feminine face of mating, to reveal as little promiscuity as possible. From ball gowns to bell-bottoms, the modesty of woman has stood the ultimate test of time, consistently protecting women from the low-risk mating strategy. This protection has long been unnecessarily misunderstood as an arbitrary confinement and control over women by men. The further from modesty we travel, the more isolated we become. There must be something sacred to bind us. Addendum. Obvious malicious motivations that have obscured use of modesty measures are clear and necessary to mention. See Figure 2.1c for examples of incorrect psychological overgeneralization, i.e. whole judgment from corrupted subsectional same act unsame motive parallel base. Although the professional prose partial read-through bolstered a sense of ease in my mind, a woeful pain continued to strike through me. Tommy had truly tainted me. No matter the level of objective exercise in the acknowledgement of truth, the depth of my despair remained unchanged, as too did my insight. Empty was I and that damn email. I destroyed it. Words aplenty, I thought to myself, feeling as though I was again thieving brevity from something total. Or a few pay the same in what the Lord as devil is due. Why must so much truth come from the tremors of despondency? I cried alone in the dark. Clasping my heart, I wished for its lost beat to strike powerfully against my heavy hand. So fragile I was, my glass house cracking. It was the rupture of my rapture in revelation. All of what I had, my knowledge, fractured. He was subverting what I was sure had been my salvation. Like a sharp projectile shattering my fragile structure, some meteor had landed so precisely upon the main support of my mind. The rock's name was Tommy. The pain climaxed in an insurmountable longing for an answer. I clambered around my head for a short time to identify where the impossible irritation had originated. I clustered together a simple question and screamed out. Why would I do that? Immediately my brain spun, and I asked myself, do what? What have I done to earn this discomfort? I rolled myself off into my bed and shut my eyes closed, pushing away my responsibility. With thoughts cracking off like confetti bombs in my broken brain, I pounded myself from within, crying out for my eyes to be shut forever. I hoped that they would be blind to the imagery, to the questions, to all that was, and all that ever more than could be. After failing to mediate myself back to calm, I sat up and cried out once more. Tommy, what have I done? Am I at risk of moral impropriety? Where to have we ventured, following behind that scoundrel, through happiness and into dissatisfaction and fear? How has this happened to me? I have done nothing but tried to help the boy, and this is the thanks I get? I must sleep now. Yes, I must sleep. He must forgive himself, and I must sleep. That assertiveness, murmured but certain, did nothing to assuage my guilt-laden grief, my eyes and ears and teeth bouncing across my linen. I had never been so lost in the unknowns of my psyche, nothing but questions remaining clear as I chuckled and groaned spasmodically into the darkness. As he wants it, I once or twice over 20 times whispered. Soon after this admittance, one of the chuckles turned into a diabolical laugh, unsettling and distinct. I laughed for minutes, adding to my insanity. At first, the laugh was an expression of my knowing of being on fire. Then the laugh suddenly stopped, and a new wave of uncontrolled laughter struck me with monumental virtue. My mind was clearly reminding me that all the pain opium driving the laughter was being distilled from my narcissistic suffering. Furthermore, that sparky cerebrum allowed me the rare laugh of reflectivity at my own limitations as they actively exploded inside my growth refusal's perfect concealment. I watched my own edge of me as most of me rampaged at itself. The lucky absurdity of it all made me tingle, but my body convulsed in frustration that surely looked like possession or seizure. My laughing turned to a growl and a felt pulse in my forehead. I ceased breathing and tensed every unsure muscle, edging towards a full-body cramp. I wanted to shatter my teeth and tear muscle from tendon. The lost few waves of emotion were beacons of peace from the discomfort, acceptances of my place and being, gifted like salty prison to some soft angel by the entirety of the world's strange arrangement. I stayed as stiff as a board for quite a while. The final thought happening that flowed out from me that night, arisen at my point of softening into a wake but post-hypnagogic state, just before the amnesia of sleep could envelop it all, was a resolute exultation. As my mind was painted red with clear distinction from reality, one thing was sent into my ethereal ear. The message rang throughout me, chiming, "We are all witnessing a masterpiece unfold." And then I was gone. This concludes Chapter 3 of In the Darkness I See by Anon Y.